The first time Marcus noticed, he almost didn't care. It was a Saturday morning in June, the kind where the heat already sat thick and heavy by 8 a.m., and he was walking through the backyard with his coffee, a weekend ritual he'd earned after 43 years of working corporate real estate, when he spotted it. A wet towel draped over the pool house chair. Not his towel, not Jennifer's either. He'd stopped mid-zip, staring at it. The towel was small, child-sized, hot pink with some cartoon character he didn't recognize already stiffening in the heat. The pool house had been locked, he was certain of it. He locked it every evening without fail, a habit born from the kind of compulsive orderliness that had made him successful but, if he was being honest with himself, had never made him happy. Marcus had picked up the towel, felt the dampness seep into his fingers, and wondered briefly if Jennifer had invited her sister's kids over without mentioning it. But Jennifer was inside with her book club, and he'd watched her leave yesterday morning with an overnight bag. She wasn't back until tonight. He'd shrugged it off, a mystery for another day. The second time was harder to dismiss. That following Wednesday, Marcus came home from the office, the Atlanta branch of Hartwell and Associates, where he'd spent 12 hours in back-to-back meetings about a shopping complex development in Buckhead, and found the pool house gate hanging open. Not forced, not broken, just open, swinging slightly in the June breeze like someone had forgotten to close it completely. This time he didn't shrug. Marcus had walked across the stamped concrete patio, past the infinity pool where their water feature never seemed to work right despite costing $12,000, and stepped inside the pool house. The air smelled wrong, not dangerous wrong, just inhabited wrong, like someone had been moving through the space recently. The storage cabinet where they kept floaties and pool toys was slightly ajar. A glass sat on the small kitchenette counter, not rinsed. He'd run his finger across the cabinet door, checking for dust. His hand came away clean. Jennifer had been in the kitchen when he'd come back inside, chopping vegetables with violent precision, her wine glass already halfway empty. "Did you have anyone in the pool house this week?" he'd asked, keeping his voice casual. She'd looked up, surprised. "What? No, why?" "The gate was open. There's a glass in there." Jennifer had set down the knife. She was 41, beautiful in the way women become beautiful when they finally stop trying so hard, her hair threaded with silver she refused to cover up, her reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Right now, she looked tired. "Maybe it's from when I was out there Sunday. I sat out there, Marcus, for an hour. I read." "You left the gate open." "I don't remember, maybe." He'd nodded, letting it drop, but it had bothered him. Jennifer wasn't the type to leave gates open. Jennifer was, in many ways, as obsessive about their property as he was. They were, perhaps, perfectly matched in that regard. The pattern became undeniable by mid-July. The pool house was being used, not by them. The evidence was small, a hair clip on the bathroom counter, chlorine-smelling water tracked across the tile floor, the cabinet where they kept snacks showing signs of disturbance. Once he found a Nintendo Switch charging cable plugged into the outlet. A child's charging cable, the kind with cartoon stickers stuck to it. Marcus had installed cameras. It was Jennifer who suggested it, actually, which surprised him. She'd been reading something on her phone, frowning, and had said casually over dinner, "You know, we should probably have cameras out there anyway, for insurance purposes, in case anyone gets hurt and tries to sue us." He'd hired the company the next day. The cameras were state-of-the-art, tiny, wireless, with cloud storage and night vision. He'd positioned one in the pool house interior, angled at the main room, and one outside near the gate. The footage automatically uploaded every hour. For 3 days, nothing happened. The pool house remained undisturbed, the gate locked. Then on the fourth day at approximately 3:47 p.m., Marcus watched the footage and felt something cold slip down his spine. 2 children had slipped through the gate, a boy and a girl, maybe 8 and 6 years old. They moved with practiced ease, as though they'd done this before many times. The boy had pulled a key from under a decorative rock. How had they found that? And let himself into the pool house. They'd stayed for exactly 32 minutes. They'd helped themselves to the snacks Jennifer kept in the cabinet. They'd played with the pool toys, and then before leaving, the boy had carefully locked the door and replaced the key. Marcus had sat back in his office chair, watching the footage again. The children's faces were clear on the camera. He didn't recognize them. He'd called Jennifer. "I'm looking at footage of 2 kids inside our pool house. Do you know who they are?" Silence, then, Marcus, can we talk about this when you get home? Tell me now. Another pause. They're probably the neighbor's kids from around the corner. They've been coming over some days. It's not a big deal. It's our private property, Jennifer. How did they get a key? I gave them the spare, Marcus. I didn't think it was a problem. They're just kids. They come when it's hot, they swim, they leave. No harm done. You gave them, he'd stopped, taking a breath. We'll discuss this when I get home. He'd hung up before she could respond. The drive home took 40 minutes. He spent the entire time thinking about liability, about insurance claims, about the fact that his wife had given access to their private pool house to children whose parents he didn't know, whom he'd never met, and had kept it a secret from him. By the time he pulled into the driveway of their $1,200,000 home in Brookhaven, Marcus had decided two things. First, that he needed to speak with the children's parents, and second, that this situation needed to end immediately. The Hendersons lived 3 houses down, in a 2-story colonial that had been on the market for 6 months before they'd moved in. Karen Henderson had waved at him once at the mailbox, and he'd waved back with the minimal friendliness the suburbs demanded. She had 3 children, he thought, maybe 4. He'd seen them in their driveway, loud, chaotic, the kind of family that seemed to operate at a constant volume above what was socially acceptable. He'd waited until the next evening to approach her. Jennifer had tried to stop him. Marcus, please don't make a thing of this. I'll talk to Karen. I'll tell them not to come back. You should have done that already. I know, I'm sorry. I just thought they're just kids and it was a safe place for them to cool off and... It's trespassing, Jennifer. They have permission from me. You don't have the authority to give permission to our entire property to random neighborhood children. He'd said this as gently as he could, but they both knew there was an edge underneath. The edge of a man whose boundaries had been crossed and who was not used to being disobeyed, not by his wife, not by anyone. The walk to the Hendersons' house took 5 minutes. Karen answered the door still wearing her work clothes. She was a project manager. Jennifer had mentioned once something corporate, and her expression shifted from surprise to something defensive the moment she saw him. Marcus, hi. Karen, do you have a minute? She'd stepped outside, letting the door close behind her. Close enough that her neighbors could see them talking, but far enough that the children inside couldn't hear. She was already crossing her arms. I assume Jennifer told you about the pool house. She mentioned it. I wanted to discuss some boundaries. Boundaries? Karen's jaw tightened. That's an interesting word choice. It's not meant hostilely. I just think it's important that we're clear about what is and isn't appropriate. The pool house is private property. While I appreciate that your children enjoy using it, I'm not comfortable with them having access without my knowledge or consent. He'd said this in his business voice, the one that had closed 100 deals, the one that was patient and reasonable and impossible to argue with because it was so fundamentally unarguable. Karen had listened, she'd nodded, and then she'd said, you know what, you're right, I apologize, I'll talk to the kids, they won't go back there. She'd said it too easily, almost like she'd been waiting for this conversation. The issue, Marcus had thought as he walked back to his own house, was resolved. Marcus discovered this 4 days later when he checked the camera footage and found a gap. A 3-hour window where the footage simply wasn't there. Not corrupted, not missing, absent in a way that suggested intentional deletion. He'd called the company that installed the system. They'd run a diagnostic. There had been no technical failure. Someone with physical access to the camera had either disabled it or removed the SD card and replaced it with a blank one. Someone who knew enough about technology to do it without damaging the equipment. Someone, in other words, who wasn't a child. He'd called Jennifer into his home office, locked the door, and showed her. This isn't kids, Jennifer. This is deliberate. This is someone tampering with our security system. Jennifer's face had gone pale. Marcus, I don't know anything about this. You gave them a key. But I didn't tell them to. I wouldn't. You know I wouldn't. And he did know. Whatever Jennifer's faults, her occasional negligence, her trust in people that bordered on naive, she wasn't someone who would encourage destruction of property or tampering with electronics. I'm calling the police, he'd said. Wait, Jennifer had gripped his arm. Wait, let me talk to Karen first. Let me ask her about this. Maybe there's an explanation. What explanation could there possibly be? I don't know, but let me try. Please, Marcus, before we bring the police into this. He'd agreed against his better judgment, because Jennifer was looking at him the way she used to when they were young, like she was asking him to believe in her, to trust her the way she was trusting him. He'd agreed because 30 seconds of his wife looking at him like that was worth more than the satisfaction of calling the cops on his neighbors. Jennifer had called Karen that evening. Marcus had listened from the study while Jennifer spoke in the kitchen, her voice carefully neutral, careful not to accuse. I wanted to check in about the pool house, Jennifer had said. Marcus noticed some issues with the security system. The footage from a few days ago is missing. We're wondering if you might know anything about that. Silence on the other end, long enough that Marcus could picture Karen's face, the calculation happening behind her eyes. I'll talk to them, Karen had finally said. I'm so sorry. They're kids, they might have thought the camera was watching them and got nervous. Kids do stupid things without thinking. They somehow disabled the camera, Karen. I don't know how they'd figure that out, but I'll talk to them, I promise. It won't happen again. Jennifer had hung up, and Marcus had come out of the study. She said she'd handle it, Jennifer had reported, and there was something in her voice, relief maybe, or something more like resignation, that suggested she didn't entirely believe it either. He'd checked the footage again the next morning. The camera was still disabled. He'd called a technician to come out immediately and reinforce the system. The technician, a young man with kind eyes and the slightly weary demeanor of someone who'd seen this kind of thing before, had installed a second, hidden camera in addition to repairing the original one. Kids are sneaky, the technician had said, climbing down from the ladder. They find patterns. If they know you have one camera, they'll figure out where it is. 2 cameras, one they can see and one they can't. That usually stops them. Marcus had paid him $600 for the additional installation and the peace of mind. For 5 days there was no activity. The gate remained locked. The pool house remained empty. On the 6th day, Marcus was reviewing footage from the hidden camera when he saw something that made him pause the video and called Jennifer into the office without explaining why. Tell me about this, he'd said, pointing at the screen. The footage showed Karen Henderson letting herself through the gate using a key, not the key they'd given Jennifer, but one of her own. She was alone, moving with the casual familiarity of someone who'd been in that space many times before. She'd gone directly to the cabinet and photographed the contents with her phone. Then she'd opened the door to the changing room, a small area with a shower and some lockers, and photographed the interior. She'd even photographed the security camera, angling her phone to get a clear shot of the model number. The entire visit had lasted 8 minutes. I have no idea what that is, Jennifer had whispered, her face draining of color. That doesn't make sense. She's photographing our property. I don't know, maybe she's trying to figure out what happened to the camera. Maybe. She's casing it, Jennifer. The words had hung in the air between them. Marcus had driven to the police station that afternoon and filed a report. The officer who took his statement, a woman named Detective Torres with tired eyes and an efficient manner, had listened without interruption. I'll issue a trespassing notice, she'd said. You'll need to post it on your property and provide a copy to the Hendersons. If they come back after that, it's criminal trespassing and we can arrest them. He'd done exactly that. Posted the notice on both gates, delivered a copy to Karen's house personally, left it in her mailbox with a printed letter explaining that further trespassing would result in legal action. Karen hadn't come to the door. He'd waited for her response, for some kind of confrontation. Instead, there had been silence. 2 weeks of silence. Marcus had begun to think it was truly over. The children had stopped coming. Karen hadn't approached him, hadn't called Jennifer, hadn't made any attempt to contact them at all. It was possible that she'd finally understood the boundaries, that she'd realized that Marcus was not a man to be trifled with, that there were consequences to certain actions. It was possible that his show of power had actually worked. He was at the office, in a meeting about a mall development in Marietta, when Jennifer called him at 3 p.m. on a Thursday. Marcus, you need to come home. He could hear something in her voice that made his stomach tighten. What happened? Just come home, please. He'd left the meeting mid-sentence, told his assistant to reschedule, and driven home at speeds that would have gotten him a ticket if he'd been caught. The drive, which normally took 35 minutes, took him 28. When he pulled into the driveway, he saw the flyers. They were posted on every mailbox on the street. He grabbed one from their own mailbox with shaking hands and read it. Beware predator in our community. My children were locked out of accessing a public amenity, our community pool, because one household is claiming exclusive use. When I attempted to negotiate a reasonable compromise, I was threatened with legal action. This household has trespassing signs and is actively discouraging children from enjoying safe recreational space. These actions constitute discrimination and potentially criminal harassment. I will be taking legal action and filing a complaint with the county. Neighbors, be aware of who you live next to. The flyer included their address and, most damningly, a photo of their home. Marcus had gone inside. Jennifer was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of tea that she hadn't touched, staring at nothing. "There's more," she'd said without looking up. "She's been calling the neighborhood Facebook group. People are not happy." Marcus's phone buzzed, then again, then multiple times. Texts from neighbors he'd never spoken to beyond a wave. Messages questioning whether he'd really threatened KARENS' children. Asked if he understood that kids needed access to recreational space. Expressed concern that he was being exclusionary and elitist. One message from a neighbor he'd seen at Whole Foods once said, "This is why nobody likes you people." The attack, when it finally came, was complete, thorough, merciless. Because Karen hadn't been stupid. She hadn't been trespassing because she was negligent or thought the rules didn't apply to her. She'd been testing him, photographing his property, setting the stage. And she'd been waiting for his response. Now she was using that response against him, reframing his entirely reasonable boundary as persecution, as an attack on children, as discrimination. She'd positioned herself as a victim and him as the villain. And in the court of public opinion, in the neighborhood that would forever see them as the people who locked out the kids, she was winning. Jennifer was crying quietly at the table. Marcus held the flyer in his hands and felt something crystallize inside him. The cold, certain knowledge that this wasn't over. That Karen Henderson was not a person who respected boundaries because she didn't recognize them as legitimate. That she viewed his property, his rules, his no, as a personal offense that needed to be corrected. "Call our lawyer," Marcus had said quietly. "For what? A lawsuit?" "For everything." That night, lying in bed, listening to Jennifer breathe shakily beside him, Marcus had opened his laptop and pulled up the hidden camera footage again. He'd watched Karen's 8 minutes of reconnaissance over and over, zooming in on her face, trying to understand what lived behind those eyes. Who was she? Not just a careless neighbor, not just a woman who'd overstepped with good intentions. Someone calculated, someone willing to manufacture outrage to get what she wanted. Someone who decided that his no was just an opening move in a negotiation she had every intention of winning. He'd thought about the legal battle that was coming, about the money it would cost, about the way this summer would unfold. Not in the peaceful way he'd imagined when school had let out, but in a war of paperwork and declarations and his word against hers in court. And he'd thought, whatever this is, whatever she's doing, she's not going to like what I have planned. Marcus hired an investigator on a Saturday morning, 2 days after the flyers appeared. His name was David Chen, and he worked out of a small office in Dunwoody with a single window that overlooked a parking lot. He was young, maybe 40, but he had the weathered demeanor of someone who'd seen humanity at its worst and had decided not to judge it too harshly. Marcus appreciated that. He appreciated Chen's apparent lack of surprise when Marcus laid out the situation. "So you want to know what she's really after?" Chen had said. It wasn't a question. "I want to know everything. Her background, her finances, why she's doing this, what the actual motivation is. The neighborhood story doesn't add up. Nobody goes to this much trouble over pool access." Chen had nodded, making notes. "Retainers 5,000. I bill hourly after that. I'm discreet, legal, and thorough. I won't find anything you don't already have a right to know, and I won't break any laws to find it. That clear?" "That's clear." They'd shaken hands. By Monday, Chen had started digging. In the meantime, Marcus's lawyer, a sharply dressed woman named Patricia Torres, no relation to the detective, apparently a common enough name, had drafted a cease and desist letter regarding the flyers and the Facebook campaign. It was a masterpiece of legal aggression, citing defamation, tortious interference, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The letter demanded that KARENS immediately remove all flyers, stop all social media posts, and provide a written apology or face litigation for damages that could reach 6 figures. The letter was delivered by certified mail on Tuesday morning. Marcus received a call from Patricia the next day. "She's lawyered up," Patricia reported. Sent a response saying the flyers are protected speech, that she has a reasonable basis for her statements, and that any damages would be mitigated by the fact that her children were, in fact, using your pool house without permission, which supports her claim that you were being unreasonable about access. They're claiming you're engaging in intentional infliction of emotional distress by posting trespassing signs that specifically target her family. That's insane. That's also potentially effective if the case goes in front of a jury who sympathizes with her narrative. We need more ammunition. Tell me you're working on something. Marcus had told her about Chen. Patricia had approved. On Friday, Chen had sent his first report. KARENS Henderson was 39 years old, divorced, and working as a project manager at a commercial construction company that had recently had some financial trouble. She'd been married to a man named David Henderson, who was now remarried and living in Charleston. The divorce, which had concluded 3 years ago, had been contentious, with significant disputes over custody and child support. According to court documents, David had been awarded primary custody of 2 of their 3 children, with KARENS getting them on alternating weekends. So the kids don't live with her full-time, Marcus had confirmed. Not according to the custody agreement. However, Chen had continued in his report, the children she's been bringing to your pool house are all 3 of them, including the 2 she doesn't have primary custody of. There are also text messages between her and her ex-husband on the local parenting forum indicating they've had ongoing disputes about his current wife's influence on the children. Marcus had read through the report twice, digesting this information. A woman fighting to maintain a relationship with her children. A woman whose life had fractured in a divorce, whose ex-husband had taken most of the custody, who was trying to be the fun parent, the one who took them to the neighbor's pool. It was almost sympathetic, except for the part where she'd trespassed, tampered with his security system, and then launched a social media campaign to demonize him to his entire neighborhood. There's more, Chen's report continued. Henderson's company has been having issues, missed payroll twice in the last year. She's currently in a salary dispute with her employer. She's claiming she was promised a promotion and raise that didn't materialize. Her finances show she's underwater on her house. Mortgage is $380,000, house is worth $410,000, but she's carrying significant credit card debt and medical bills. Medical bills. The next pages outlined a series of medical procedures dating back 18 months. Therapy sessions. Psychiatric medications, a 4-week inpatient stay at a mental health facility that she'd apparently told people was a family vacation. Marcus had sat back in his desk chair, reading this litany of suffering. She's financially desperate, Chen had written in his summary. She's emotionally unstable, and she's fighting for custody arrangements that aren't going in her favor. What she's doing with your pool house, the trespassing, the confrontation with you, the social media campaign, none of it makes logical sense unless you understand that she's not operating from a place of logic. She's operating from a place of desperation. Marcus had closed the report and sat in silence for a long time. He'd called Jennifer into the study and shown her. She'd read it slowly, her expression shifting from anger to sadness to something that looked almost like pity. She's not well, Jennifer had said quietly. She's also committing crimes. I know. And she damaged our reputation in this neighborhood. I know that too. So what are you saying? Jennifer had looked at him, really looked at him, in a way she hadn't in weeks. I'm saying that maybe the question isn't how to win against her. Maybe the question is how to make this stop. By letting her win, by capitulating, by showing her that if you're aggressive enough and unstable enough, you can bully people into giving you what you want. No, Jennifer had said, by choosing not to engage in the fight at all. He'd wanted to argue with her. He'd wanted to explain how the law worked, how boundary setting worked, how you didn't let people run roughshod over you because they were having a hard time. But there was something in Jennifer's voice, a weariness, a kind of emotional exhaustion that suggested she'd already been fighting this battle much longer than he realized. He'd dropped it for the moment, but he'd kept the investigator on the case. Over the next 2 weeks, Chen compiled more information. KARENS' ex-husband was indeed unsympathetic to her situation. The emails Chen obtained showed David referring to her as unstable and unreliable. The custody arrangement had been designed to limit her ability to disrupt the children's lives. The financial records showed she was genuinely struggling, that the promotion and raise had fallen through, and that she'd taken a second job working weekend shifts that made her relationship with her children even more fractured. She was, in short, a person whose life was collapsing. And Marcus's boundary, his refusal to let her children use his pool house, had been the pressure point where that collapse became visible. He understood that now. What he didn't understand was what to do with that knowledge. Patricia Torres had wanted to proceed with the lawsuit. She'd prepared the complaint, outlined her strategy, calculated damages at $250,000. "We have a strong case," she'd said. "She committed tortious interference, she defamed your character, and her actions have caused you quantifiable harm, legal fees, loss of use and enjoyment of your property, emotional distress. A jury could award substantial damages." "And then what?" Marcus had asked. "And then you win. You get money. She gets a judgment against her, which will destroy her credit and make it even harder for her to recover from her current situation." He'd thought about that for a long moment. "Don't file yet," he'd said. "Give me another week." That night he'd made a decision that he knew would cost him something. He wasn't sure what, but he'd learned enough about Karen to understand that this situation had two possible endings. The ending where he destroyed her, and the ending where he chose something different. He'd called David Chen. "I need you to find something else," Marcus had said. "I need you to find out what Karen Henderson actually needs, not what she's saying she wants, what would actually help her." "That's not usually how this works," Chen had replied. "I know, but that's what I'm asking." By Monday, Chen had sent a new report. It was much shorter than the previous ones. Karen Henderson needed two things. First, she needed more custody time with her children, not just the negotiated weekends, but genuine shared parenting. The ex-husband had been resistant, but there was nothing prohibiting a renegotiation if both parties agreed. Second, and perhaps more importantly, she needed money. Not a lot, maybe $5,000 to clear her credit cards and give her breathing room. And she needed a different job, one that paid better and didn't require weekend shifts that kept her away from her kids. "That's it," Marcus had said. "That's really it." "Based on what I can find," Chen had confirmed. "If those two things were solved, the rest would probably resolve on its own. The desperation would lift. The behavior would probably stop." Marcus had paid Chen's final bill and dismissed him. Then he'd done something that Patricia Torres explicitly advised against. He'd asked Jennifer to set up a meeting with Karen. They met at a coffee shop in Emery Village, neutral territory where neither of them would feel at a disadvantage. Karen had arrived already defensive, probably expecting some kind of confrontation. She looked worse than she had at the mailbox, thinner, drawn, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping. Marcus had bought her a coffee before she even sat down. "I'm not here to fight," he'd said. Karen had laughed, a brittle, bitter sound. "Then why are you here?" "Because I had someone look into your situation, and I realized that I don't actually know you, and I was responding to your behavior rather than understanding what was causing it." She'd stared at him, something in her expression shifting from defensive to confused. "You had someone investigate me." "Yes. That's invasion of privacy." "Yes, it is, and I'm not proud of it, but I needed to understand whether you were actually a threat or whether you were just struggling." Karen had wrapped her hands around the coffee cup he'd bought her, and her eyes had gotten wet. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," she'd said quietly. "I wasn't trying to my kids. The thing is, my kids live with my ex-husband most of the time, and his wife, she's fine, she's nice, but she's their stepmother, and I'm barely in their lives. And then you built this perfect pool, and they loved it, and for a few hours on a hot day, I could just be the fun mom. I could give them something. And then you posted signs, and you threatened me, and—" She'd stopped, unable to continue. Marcus had waited. "My life fell apart," she'd finally said. My marriage, my kids, my job, all of it. And instead of dealing with it like an adult, I decided to make you the reason. Because you were close and you were a target, and making you the reason for my problems felt better than admitting that I was the reason. She'd looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. I'm in therapy. I've been in therapy. I take medication. And I know that what I did was wrong. But I was drowning, and your pool house was the only thing that made me feel like I was doing something right as a mother, and when you took that away. She'd stopped again. Marcus had let the silence exist between them for a moment. What do you need? He'd asked. I need my kids, Karen had said immediately. I need to be a real parent to them, not just a weekend visitor. She'd paused. I need a job that doesn't destroy me. I need to not be so terrified all the time about money and my future and whether I'm failing at everything. He'd listened to her lay out the contours of her life in this coffee shop, with the ambient sound of milk steamers and conversations around them. And he'd made a decision that he knew Jennifer would support and that Patricia Torres would definitely not. I can't fix your custody situation, he'd said. That's between you and your ex-husband, but the other things, maybe we can figure something out. Over the next hour, they'd actually talked. Not fought, not negotiated, not performed versions of themselves for an audience. Just talked. Marcus had explained why he'd felt so threatened by the trespassing, the security camera tampering, the violation of boundaries. Karen had explained what it felt like to be losing custody of her children, to be the kind of parent who had to ask permission to be part of her own kids' lives. By the time they'd left the coffee shop, they'd sketched out the beginning of something. Marcus had a commercial real estate company. He knew people. He could make some calls, see if there was a better opportunity for Karen, something that paid more, something that didn't require weekend shifts. It wasn't charity. She was clearly competent, intelligent, capable of doing good work. She just needed a break. As for the pool house, he'd said she could bring the kids once a week, supervised if she wanted. No more trespassing. No more secret visits, just a legitimate arrangement, something above board, something that made her a guest rather than a criminal. Karen had cried again when he'd said that. Why are you doing this? She'd asked. After everything I did. Because I think you're a good person in a bad situation, Marcus had said, and because my wife asked me to choose kindness instead of victory. When he'd gotten home, Jennifer had been waiting. He'd told her everything. She'd listened without interrupting, and when he was done, she'd reached across the counter and taken his hand. Thank you, she'd said. For what? For being better than your first instinct. He'd hired an investigator, and it had cost him money. He'd consulted a lawyer, and she'd wanted to sue. And then he'd chosen to do neither of those things. He'd chosen instead to actually see Karen, not as a threat, not as an adversary, but as a person who was drowning and had reached out in the only way she knew how. It wasn't heroic, it was just the right thing to do. The agreement formalized over the next few weeks. He made some calls and found Karen a job at a commercial development firm in Peachtree. Better pay, better hours, no weekend shifts. She started the following month. She and David renegotiated custody, with David's new wife's encouragement, which came from the understanding that Karen was getting help and was stabilizing. They agreed to a more generous shared parenting arrangement. The kids would be with Karen 3 days a week instead of every other weekend. Her lawyer helped her file, and it was approved. And Marcus's pool house did become a place where Karen brought her kids on Wednesday afternoons when she picked them up from school. They'd swim for an hour. Jennifer would bring out snacks. It became a normal neighborhood thing, the kind of thing that nobody made a big deal about anymore. The neighborhood gossip shifted. Karen became the woman who was really doing better, who'd gotten help, who seemed so much healthier lately. The flyers disappeared from mailboxes. The Facebook group moved on to newer grievances. Life went back to normal. Except it hadn't, not quite. Because Marcus had learned something about himself in all of this. He'd learned that his first instinct was to win, to dominate, to establish dominance through force of law and force of will. And he'd learned that Jennifer had been quietly desperate for him to learn a different way. He'd learned that there was a version of himself that he could become, a version that was maybe not weaker but different. Wiser, maybe, more human. One evening in August, after Karen had picked up her kids and driven home, Marcus and Jennifer were sitting on the patio by the pool. The water was calm, perfect, catching the light of the setting sun. I was planning to destroy her, Marcus said quietly. If you hadn't asked me to talk to her, I would have sued her into poverty. I know, Jennifer said. How did you know? How did you know that was what I needed to do differently? Jennifer leaned her head on his shoulder. Because I've been watching you destroy yourself for years, Marcus, and I kept hoping you'd figure out that winning isn't the same as being happy, that the most powerful thing you can do isn't always the most aggressive thing. She paused. With Karen, you actually chose to be powerful in a different way. You chose to be strong enough to offer grace instead of justice. He'd held his wife's hand as the sun set over their perfect pool, and he'd thought, this is what I almost lost. This person, this moment, this understanding. He'd thought, I could have had the money and the judgment and the victory, and it would have cost me everything. The pool house sat quiet and empty beyond the gate, and Marcus finally felt at peace with the space. But that peace, unbeknownst to him, was about to be shattered by something neither he nor Jennifer had anticipated. It was David Chen who called him, 3 weeks after everything had been resolved. Chen sounded apologetic, uncomfortable. I probably shouldn't be calling you, Chen had said. In fact, my professional ethics are telling me not to call you, but I thought you'd want to know. Know what? I was following up on some of the financial records I pulled when I was investigating Henderson, and I found something. I should have noticed it before, but I didn't put the pieces together until today. Marcus had sat down. KARENS' medical bills from her inpatient psychiatric stay, the one that was technically a vacation. Those bills were paid by someone else's insurance. What do you mean, someone else's? I mean the insurance wasn't in her name. It was in the name of a company that filed for bankruptcy 6 months ago, a development company that was building a shopping complex in Buckhead. Marcus's stomach had gone cold. Chen, whose company? Yours, Marcus. Hartwell and Associates had a joint venture with another developer on that project. The development fell through, the company dissolved, and a lot of people got hurt financially, including your partner, according to my research. His name was James Brenner. Marcus had closed his eyes. You're saying Karen Henderson worked for James Brenner? According to the company records, James Brenner was married to a woman named Eleanor Chen before he married his current wife. Eleanor and James had a difficult divorce about 7 years ago. Eleanor took her maiden name back and is now known as Karen Henderson. The room had started to spin. That's not possible, Marcus had whispered. I thought the same thing, but I verified it. Eleanor Chen and Karen Henderson are the same person. She changed her first name legally. Why would she do that, unless she was running away from something or hiding? Unless, Marcus had realized in a flash of terrible clarity, she was someone who had a very good reason to hate him. He'd hung up and called Patricia Torres immediately, his hands shaking. I need everything you have on James Brenner, he'd said. Everything, every deal, every lawsuit, every financial transaction, I need it now. It had taken Patricia 6 hours to compile the information. What she'd found was, in retrospect, obvious. The Buckhead development was supposed to be a flagship project for Hartwell and Associates. It was supposed to make Marcus significant money and establish his reputation as the premier developer in Atlanta. He and his partners were supposed to transform a strip of abandoned strip malls into a mixed-use development with high-end retail and residential units. James Brenner had been the other primary partner. He'd put in his life savings. He'd leveraged his houses. He'd taken out loans. And then Marcus had made a series of decisions based on what he'd thought were best practices and market analysis, but what had actually been strategic oversights that had caused the project to fail. The development had been halted mid-construction. The money had dried up. James Brenner had lost everything. His savings, his house, his marriage. He'd ended up filing for bankruptcy. His ex-wife, Eleanor, who'd become Karen, had gone into debt because of the medical crisis he'd experienced, a mental health break that required hospitalization. And then that same man, Marcus Hartwell, the one who destroyed James Brenner's life, had moved to Brookhaven with his wife, had built a beautiful home, had installed a perfect pool, had lived his life in the exact way James Brenner could no longer do. The pool house, the kids, the trespassing. It had never been about the children. It had been about Karen systematically testing him, finding his boundaries, and then exposing them to see if he was still the kind of man who put property over people. It had been a calculated assessment of his character, a way of determining whether the man who destroyed her family was capable of change. And in the end, he'd passed the test, but only because he hadn't known he was being tested. Marcus had called Karen that night, not Jennifer. Jennifer couldn't know yet. Jennifer would look at him with the understanding that this was his responsibility to address, that the grace he'd offered to Karen had been predicated on her honesty and her genuine need, not on deception and calculated manipulation. Karen had answered on the second ring. "I know who you are," Marcus had said without preamble. "Eleanor." Silence, long enough that he heard her breathing on the other end. "I wanted to see if you'd changed," Karen had finally said quietly. "I wanted to know if you were still the same person who destroyed James." "I am," Marcus had said. "I made the decisions that I made. I believed they were right. I still do, actually. They were business decisions in a high-risk environment." "My husband lost his mind, Marcus. He was hospitalized. He had a breakdown so severe that he couldn't recognize our children." "I know, and I'm sorry for that, but that wasn't my fault." "Wasn't it?" Karen's voice had sharpened. "You made promises about that development. You told investors, you told James, that the risk was manageable. You told people to put their life savings into something you couldn't deliver." "I couldn't predict the market collapse. I couldn't predict that permits would be held up. I couldn't predict." "No, but you could have been honest about the risks, instead of selling people on a dream." Marcus had had no response to that because it was true. "So you decided to test me," he'd said instead. "By trespassing, by breaking into my security system, by lying to your ex-husband about where your children were. I decided to test whether you'd changed, whether this version of Marcus Hartwell, the one with the successful company and the beautiful house and the wife who loves him, whether that Marcus had any capacity for compassion. And I found out that you do, but only when you're forced to, only when confronted. You didn't give freely. You didn't offer grace because it was the right thing to do. You offered it because you felt threatened." Marcus had no response to that either, because it was also true. "What do you want?" he'd asked finally. "I want you to understand what you did, not just to James, but to our children. Do you know what it's like to raise kids who have a father with PTSD and depression because someone destroyed his career? Do you know what it's like to be the one cleaning up that mess while the person who caused it lives in a mansion?" "No," Marcus had said quietly, "I don't." "Well, now you know. Now you know what you took from us." She'd hung up. Marcus had sat in his office for a long time, not moving. In the morning, he'd had to tell Jennifer everything. She'd listened without interrupting, her face getting grayer as he spoke. "So the entire thing was a setup," she'd said when he'd finished. "Yes. And we gave her money. We gave her a job referral. We gave her access to our lives." "Yes. And the worst part is that despite all of that being manipulative and dishonest, she was also telling the truth about what you did, about the consequences." Marcus hadn't been able to argue with that. "What are you going to do?" Jennifer had asked. He'd thought about it for a long moment. "I don't know yet," he'd finally said. But he did know, actually. He knew what justice demanded. He knew what his lawyer would tell him to do. He knew that Karen had committed fraud, had manipulated him, had used deception to extract benefit from his family. But he also knew that she had a point. Whatever her motives, whatever games she'd been playing, the underlying truth remained. Marcus had made promises he couldn't keep. He'd taken risks with other people's money. He'd been a central force in the destruction of James Brenner's life. And then he'd lived very, very well while James suffered. The question was whether he was going to respond to Karen's manipulation with more domination, or whether he was going to sit with the uncomfortable truth that maybe, just maybe, she deserved something from him. He walked into her office at 8 in the morning, before she'd had her coffee, with a proposal that made her sit back in her chair with a look of concern. "You want to do what exactly?" she'd asked. "I want to contact James Brenner and offer him money," Marcus had repeated. "A significant amount. Enough to cover his losses from the Buckhead project plus interest for 7 years of financial hardship." "Marcus, do you understand what you're doing? You're admitting liability. You're acknowledging that you did something wrong. That's opening you up to lawsuits, to claims." "I know. And you're doing it anyway." "I'm doing it anyway." Patricia had set down her pen and folded her hands on her desk. "Why, Because it's the right thing to do. That's not a sufficient legal answer. It's the only answer I have. They'd gone back and forth, Patricia playing devil's advocate, Marcus refusing to be convinced otherwise. In the end, Patricia had done what he'd asked because she was a professional and her job was to make his wishes legal, even when she thought he was being catastrophically stupid. She'd reached out to James Brenner's attorney, who'd seemed shocked to hear from Marcus's side. A meeting was arranged for neutral territory, Patricia's conference room, 10 a.m. on a Thursday. James Brenner looked like he'd aged 20 years in the seven since the development collapse. He was gaunt, gray, with the manner of a man who'd learned not to trust anything good. His attorney was aggressive from the moment he sat down, anticipating a fight. "What is this about?" the attorney had demanded. "It's about responsibility," Marcus had said quietly. He'd laid out the offer, $450,000. James's original investment in the development, plus 7 years of lost income, plus interest. Enough to recoup what he'd lost, not to make him whole. Nothing could do that, but to lift the financial weight. James had stared at him, without speaking for what felt like an eternity. "Why?" he'd finally asked, his voice rough. "Because I made decisions that hurt you, and I've spent 7 years pretending I didn't, and I'm not going to do that anymore." "This is about that woman," James had said, not a question. "Partly." "Karen Eliner," James had laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "She's been watching you, hasn't she? Testing you." "Yes. And she told you what happened to me." "She told me what happened to all of you. To her, to the kids, to you." James had looked at his attorney, then back at Marcus. "I don't want your money," he'd said. The words had hung in the air. James, his attorney, had started, but James had held up a hand. "I don't want it. Do you know why? Because if I take it, I forgive you. And I'm not ready to forgive you. I'm not sure I ever will be." Marcus had felt something break inside his chest. "Then what do you want?" "I want you to understand that money doesn't fix this. It doesn't give me back the years I lost to depression. It doesn't give my kids back the father I was when everything fell apart. It doesn't fix what you broke." "I know." "Do you? Do you really know? Or are you just saying that because it makes you feel better about what you did?" The question had been a punch to the gut because Marcus had realized he didn't actually know. He'd never really sat with the full weight of his actions. He'd compartmentalized them, moved on, succeeded, and let his success justify his past decisions. "I'm going to offer it to you anyway," Marcus had finally said. "Not to make myself feel better, not to buy forgiveness, but because it's the minimum thing I can do." He'd slid the check across the conference table. James had stared at it without touching it. "I'm also going to talk to Hartwell and Associates about restructuring our risk management and our investor agreements," Marcus had continued. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again. Not to make me feel noble, but because if I don't, I'm choosing to let other people suffer the way you suffered." James had finally looked at him. "You're not going to sue Karen," he'd said. It wasn't a question. "No." "You should. She manipulated you. She broke into your security system. She lied to you." "She did, and if I sued her, I'd be proving her right. That I only care about winning, that I only care about justice when it benefits me." James had picked up the check and looked at it. The number was significant, but it wasn't going to change his life. It wasn't going to fix the broken parts. "Eliner thinks you're a good man who made bad choices," James had said quietly. "She wanted to know if you were capable of being better. I think she's still naive, even after everything." "Why?" "Because choosing not to sue her doesn't make you a good man, Marcus. It just means you're smart enough to understand optics. It just means you're choosing integrity because it's convenient." He'd been right. Marcus had known it even as he'd heard the words. "So what do you want me to do?" Marcus had asked. "I want you to stop. I want you to stop pretending that you understand the consequences of your actions. I want you to stop offering grace as though it somehow makes you absolved. I want you to understand that what you did will follow me for the rest of my life, and there's nothing you can do about that. Not money, not apologies, not public confession. You have to live with that. And when you can really live with that, when you can accept that some things can't be fixed, then maybe you'll have learned something." Marcus had nodded slowly. "I can do that," he'd said. James had picked up the check, folded it once, and set it on the table between them. "I'm going to take this. Not because I forgive you, but because my kids need to eat and I need to pay my therapist. But I want you to understand that this transaction doesn't balance anything. It doesn't make us even. It just means I'm using your guilt to finance my recovery." He'd stood up. His attorney had gathered his papers. "Tell Alina I said hello," James had said at the door. "Tell her I appreciate what she did even if the method was unconventional, and tell her she's right about you. You're capable of being better. You're just not there yet." After they'd left, Marcus had sat alone in Patricia's conference room for 20 minutes. Patricia had waited at her desk, giving him space. When he'd finally come out, she'd looked at him with something like sadness. "That went about as well as could be expected," she'd said gently. "He's right," Marcus had replied. "None of this makes it right." "No, but it's something." "Is it enough?" "I don't think there is an enough, Marcus. I think James is right. This is something you have to live with now. The fact that you tried to make it right and it doesn't actually fix anything, that's the weight you carry." He'd nodded, accepting it. Marcus had driven home in silence, not wanting to think too hard about what came next. Jennifer had been waiting on the porch. He'd told her everything, the meeting, James's response, the check that hadn't fixed anything. She'd listened without interrupting. "What are you going to do about Karen?" she'd asked when he was done. "I don't know. She manipulated us. She broke into our property. She committed fraud in a way." "Yes. And I'm not going to press charges." "No, I don't think you are." They'd sat on the porch swing as the evening came on, listening to the neighborhood sounds. "Do you think she's right?" Jennifer had asked, "about whether you've actually changed?" "I think James is right," Marcus had said slowly. "I think I chose integrity in the moment because it was convenient, because it made me look better. I'm not sure I did it for the right reasons." "What would be the right reasons?" "Honestly, I don't know anymore." That night, Marcus had called Karen and asked to meet her again, not at a neutral location, but at his own house. She'd been wary, but she'd agreed. She'd sat in the same kitchen where Jennifer made him coffee and packed his lunch. She'd sat at the same table where they'd discussed the Buckhead development years ago, where Marcus had convinced her ex-husband to risk everything. "I know who you are," Marcus had said again. "And I know why you did what you did, and I'm not going to press charges or pursue legal action." "Because I did you a favor?" Karen had asked. "Because I showed you who you really are?" "Because you were right, and because pursuing you would be the same pattern I've been repeating. I destroy someone, and then when they confront me, I win against them." Karen had wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I wasn't trying to forgive you," she'd said quietly. "That wasn't the point. I was trying to understand if you were someone worth having in my neighborhood, someone my kids could theoretically develop a healthy relationship with. And I think you are. I think you're capable of understanding what you did wrong. I think you're capable of growth, even if it's not perfect, even if your motives aren't pure. I think you're just a person trying to figure out how to live with what you've done. That's more generous than I deserve." "Probably, but I'm tired of being angry, Marcus. I'm tired of hating you. And my kids deserve a neighborhood where they can play without me being constantly consumed by resentment against one of their classmates' parents." She'd sipped her coffee. "The job you got me, I'm doing well there, really well. The supervisor thinks I have real potential, and custody is better now. I get the kids most days. So when I say this isn't about revenge anymore, I mean it." "What is it about now?" "About understanding that people are complicated, that you can do terrible things and still be redeemable. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop hating someone and just let them be human." Marcus had felt tears on his face, without entirely understanding why. "Thank you," he'd said, and he'd meant it for all of it. The trespassing that had forced him to see, the deception that had revealed the truth, the anger that had demanded accountability. "One more thing," Karen had said. "James took the check, but he's going to do something with it. He's starting a nonprofit about sustainable development and investor protection. He's going to use your money to help other people avoid what happened to him." Marcus had closed his eyes. "So it does do some good," Karen had continued. "Not in the way you intended, but it does." After she'd left, Marcus had sat alone in his kitchen and made a decision. He called his partner at Hartwell and Associates, a man named Richard, and told him he was stepping down from the company. Not retiring, not yet, but stepping into a different role. He would work with investors and developers on risk mitigation and ethical practices. He would use his expertise not to build more projects, but to make sure the ones that were built didn't destroy people's lives. Richard had been shocked, but he'd accepted it. The pool house, in the end, never became the point of contention it had been. Karen brought her kids every Wednesday. They swam, they laughed, they were just a family using someone else's pool. And Marcus watched from the kitchen window, understanding finally that sometimes the victory isn't in winning. Sometimes the victory is in being willing to lose and live with that loss, to carry it, to let it change you. The water in the pool stayed perfectly clear, just as he designed it to be. But he'd learned that crystal clarity was the least important thing about a home. What mattered was that on Wednesday afternoons, a woman who'd once wanted to destroy him felt safe enough to bring her children into his space. What mattered was that he'd learned, through failure and humiliation and the weight of his own consequences, that some things couldn't be fixed, they could only be survived. The summer ended. Jennifer went back to her book club. Marcus went back to work in his new role, trying to be a different kind of professional than he'd been before. And sometimes, in the morning, Marcus would stand by the pool and remember the moment when everything had shifted. When the boundary he'd been so certain about had turned out to be far more complicated than he'd understood. When defending his property had meant losing something more valuable, his certainty about who he was. It wasn't a happy ending, exactly. But it was an honest one. And that, Marcus had finally learned, was the only kind that actually mattered. 6 months later, in December, there was a Christmas party at the Hartwells' house. Half the neighborhood was invited. Karen came with her kids. James Brenner came too, which surprised everyone, but which Marcus had arranged with careful planning and genuine hope that healing could be shared, even if it was imperfect. They didn't become friends, exactly, but they existed in the same space without hostility, and that was more than Marcus had any right to expect. Jennifer pulled him aside at one point, while everyone was eating. "You look lighter," she'd said. "I feel different. Is it better?" Marcus had thought about it. The lawsuit he didn't pursue, the money he'd given away, the career shift he'd made, the way every single day he had to live with the knowledge that some of what he'd destroyed couldn't be fixed. "No," he'd said finally, "but it's honest, and honest is better than better." The water in the pool house had been drained for winter, but the space was warm, inviting, no longer a point of contention, but just a room where people sometimes gathered. And Marcus Hartwell, who'd spent his life building things and trying to control outcomes, finally understood that the most valuable thing he could build was the capacity to live with being wrong.